Welcome back, students. This is Module 4.3.2, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, of course, is one of the pillars of modern biology, the other being Gregor Mendel. We've already studied Mendel's work about genetics, and Darwin had no knowledge of how genetics worked, and he would have benefited greatly from Mendel's findings. But Charles Darwin, he was born into privilege. He was born in a very stratified society of classes in England, in Victorian England. He was a naturalist by interest, and his father was a doctor, Robert Darwin. His grandfather was a doctor as well. And young Charles was always avidly interested in nature, and at first he was going to become a doctor too. He went to medical school when he was still a teenager, different than the medical education of today, and he attended a surgery. And in those days, before anesthesia, they would simply tie down the patient and cut while he screamed. And Charles Darwin had a very sensitive constitution, and so he left medical school and didn't tell his father for quite a while, continued to take his money and such. And young Charles, eventually the family became very concerned about what to do with him, and it was decided he should earn a degree in divinity and become a minister, because ministers were of the right social status. They didn't have to work all that hard. They, gave sermons on Sundays, but often they used examples from nature as a testament to God, this kind of thing. And so it was very common for people who are interested in natural history or nature to become ministers. And Darwin did indeed earn his degree in divinity, and he was invited. During all that time, though, he continued his avid interest in nature, and as a consequence, he was invited to serve as a naturalist on a ship that was going on a voyage around the world, the HMS Beagle. His father, Dr. Darwin, refused to let him, and finally Charles Darwin's relative, Josiah Wedgwood, stepped in and kind of convinced Dr. Darwin to let him go. And Dr. Darwin was only concerned for the well-being of his son. During the glory years of the British Empire, it was very common for young men from Britain to leave and go to the colonies and never come home. Travel was uncertain. There were native uprisings and diseases, and so it was a prudent concern that Dr. Darwin showed. But Charles did sign on as a naturalist for the Beagle. By the way, HMS stands for His Majesty's Ship or Her Majesty's Ship, depending on whether the monarch is a king or queen at that time. In any case, the Beagle's voyage was to go and map the coast of South America, making maritime maps. And during that time, Charles Darwin, he went inland on expeditions, and he observed the geology and flora and fauna. Flora is all the plants of a region, fauna is all the animals of a region, and he also saw fossils. So he had a chronological as well as a geographical perspective that he gained in these studies, and he made great numbers of collections and took very careful notes, and he learned much more than he would have ever staying in England. He came to the Galapagos Islands, an archipelago, which is a group of islands off the west coast of South America. And it was a chain of islands, of volcanic islands that were relatively young. And so they had lots of lava was still visible, and not very much plant life, not very much animal life. Two groups of animals that were very important in Charles Darwin's studies of the Galapagos were the finches, of which there were a number of species, and tortoises, also a number of species. Very interestingly, about the tortoises, old hands on the ship could tell which island a tortoise came from by the shape of its shell. And these are giant tortoises, several feet long, a couple feet high. I can remember riding on the back of such a giant tortoise at the zoo when I was a little kid. They don't let you do that anymore, I guess, but at the time. And so here are some of those tortoises, and they're really very impressive animals. And here's a slide that shows some of the different shapes of shells that they have. Very interestingly, the Beagle was a small ship. This is a modern reproduction of that ship. It was decommissioned and sold for scrap. Here's Charles Darwin looking very old in his later years. Here we can see, this shows a map with the journey that Charles Darwin took. That's not working so good. There, it works better. There off the coast of South America is where the Beagle spent most of its time. And then it went zippity-doo-dah around Australia. Even though there's a town called Darwin in Australia, Charles Darwin was sick when they were there, and he didn't really do much observation of marsupials in Australia, which is kind of a shame. And as you can see here, the sailors celebrate after returning home, after being away for 5 long years. Here's a painting that was done by Conrad Martins, who was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. I think he was on the Beagle for part of the time. Anyway, this is a painting he made off of Tierra del Fuego, down on Cape Horn, the south end of South America. The Beagle almost met its end, and Charles Darwin would have also. The Beagle was knocked over onto its side by a big wave, and it righted itself, and it was knocked over again. And fortunately, it righted itself before the next wave came. Otherwise, we would have never heard of Charles Darwin and evolution. It would be somebody else. In any case, Charles Darwin returned home with all the crew, and he published an account of his trip called The Voyage of the Beagle. And this kind of made Charles Darwin a superstar in the inner circles of science in England. Very popular account of what he saw and what he learned. It wasn't until 6 years after he returned home, and by this time he was moving in some of the best circles of English science, he outlined his theory of evolution. But he said nothing. He studied and gathered information in support of his idea, but he did not publicly proclaim his interest or belief in the idea of evolution. He knew it would cause social upheaval, and he was not interested in that kind of upset. It was some 20 years after his trip that he had somewhat of a reputation for being interested in evolution and evolutionary ideas, that he received a letter from a young naturalist who was working in Southeast Asia. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. And Darwin said it looked as though Wallace had taken a page from his journal. The idea was so similar to the idea that he had outlined years before. Charles Darwin actually co-presented Wallace's paper with one of his own in 1858. And then the next year, Darwin by himself published his big book that he'd been collecting information for many, many years. And of all of the dates that I give you, this is one date I think you should know. You should know that 1859 was the year in which Charles Darwin first published his ideas on evolution. The title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And that was the first edition, sold out in one day. And this is a very valuable book today. Copies of the first edition go for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so, if you want to give me one, I guess I might take it. Of course, I couldn't take it, but nevertheless, it is a book that has great attraction for many biologists and scientists. Of course, the publication did result in what Charles Darwin had feared. There was social upheaval. Some people said he was a devil, and he often was caricatured in publications. In later years, his white beard made him a very easy target for the cartoonists to make fun of, but others said he was a genius. And among modern scientists, Darwin is respected and renowned, and he indeed was really a very good role model for what a scientist should be. So one of his contemporaries, Thomas Huxley, upon hearing Charles Darwin's idea, he kind of slapped his forehead and said, "How stupid not to have thought of that before." And of course, there's Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, because Huxley would speak in public to defend Darwin. Darwin was very shy and retiring, did not like conflict, so he stayed out at his country estate at Down and let Huxley do a lot of the fighting. Here's a quote. I'll just zip through it pretty quick. Huxley says, "I finished your book yesterday. Since I read von Baer's essays 9 years ago, no work on natural history science I have met with has made so great an impression on me, and I do most heartily thank you for the great store of new views you have given me. As for your doctrines, I am prepared to go to the stake if requisite. I trust you will not allow yourself to be in any way disgusted or annoyed by the considerable abuse and misrepresentation which, unless I greatly mistake, is in store for you. And as to the curs who will bark and yelp, you must recollect that some of your friends, at any rate, are endowed with an amount of combativeness which, though you have often and justly rebuked it, may stand you in good stead. I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness." And you can see why he was Darwin's bulldog. He said he would fight for him. And here, just for fun, I'll show you what Huxley's claws and beak look like. There you go, claws and beak. Okay, now I'm just being silly. So let's look at Darwin's dangerous idea, his big idea that really rocked English society and have really transformed modern science. It was part of an ongoing series of events, but it was nevertheless a critically important milestone in modern science. So Darwin's idea, his theory, is called the theory of evolution by natural selection. And there are 4 basic steps, at least I present it here in 4 steps. The first is variation, and that was the observation that individuals in a population vary in many ways, and some of these variations are in fact heritable under genetic control. And this is true not only of humans. If you look around the classroom, when you're in a classroom and you see all your fellow students, you can see you all look different. But it's also true among all populations of species. If we look at mesquite trees, or if we look at fish, or if we look at toads, or if we look at northern mockingbirds, it doesn't matter. We can find that there are, in fact, differences among individuals. So variation is the rule among natural populations. A second point in Darwin's idea, in his theory of evolution by natural selection, is the concept of over-reproduction, simply that species produce more offspring than can survive. And as a consequence, there has to be a struggle for survival. And that really leads us to the third point. If you take the first 2 points, more individuals are born than can survive, not all individuals are the same, that there's going to be a struggle for existence, and not all individuals are the same in that struggle because of variation. Some individuals will have favorable variations, some will have unfavorable variations. Those with favorable variations will survive and reproduce at a higher rate, which means, of course, if they survive and reproduce at a higher rate, it means the next generation will have more individuals with those favorable variations by proportion than the previous generation did. And that is the 4th step. Evolution is simply a change in the genetic structure of a population, and having more individuals with favorable variations survive and reproduce means that there is a genetic change and that more of the favorable variations will be found in the next generation, and that is evolution. Here are the same 4 steps outlined in a little bit different way. This actually shows a vernal pool, which means a springtime pool in a California grassland. And you can see out in the horizon where the boundary between pink and green is. That was the border of the pool. Where the pink is, that was all filled with water. And as the water receded, these monkey flowers were found there. And as we look among them, they all look pretty similar until we see an individual like this. And you can see that that individual has white flowers. It's a mutant monkey flower that doesn't have pigment in its flowers. And so even though this one's easy to spot as being different, Darwin's point was they're all different. If we would measure how many flowers, how tall the flowers, how wide the leaves, how many roots, the colors of the flowers, there's slight differences among all the different monkey flowers, and more than just the obvious white mutant there. And there's our mutant, I suppose. And on we go. Second point being over-reproduction. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Now this is kind of cheating because this shows a nesting colony of gannets, and they nest in high concentrations. But the point is that there's a lot of them. There's a lot of these too. Ooh, people in a swimming pool, and they're feeling warm spots. Time to get out. This is a real swimming pool, not doctored. This is, I believe, in China. This swimming pool occurs. But more about over-reproduction in a natural sense. For example, the ability of a single toad to lay 30,000 eggs in 1 year is quite amazing. That's a lot of young toads. A coastal redwood tree can produce 10 billion seeds in its lifetime. The cones are very small, smaller than the end of your thumb usually, and the seeds are tiny, as you can see here with the ruler, and they produce 10 billion in their lifetime. And so a question for you to contemplate for these two species, the toad and the redwood, and all species, is to contemplate how many of those seeds or how many of those toadlets have to survive for the population to remain the same. So how many? And the answer is only 2. One to replace the male and one to replace the female. And that's the way it is for all sexual species. For asexual species, only one individual has to survive to replace the single parent. But here in sexually reproducing species, you have to replace both parents. So if you produce more than 2 offspring that survive, then the population grows. If you produce fewer than 2 replacement level reproduction, then the population shrinks. And so that's quite sobering to think about, all those young. And so it was common for nature to be viewed as this bloody struggle. I think Alfred Lord Tennyson, a Victorian poet, he wrote of nature red in tooth and claw, bloody teeth and bloody claws, because what happens to these 30,000 little toadlets? Well, they become grist for the mill of evolution, which means they're ground up in a mill. And the mill, of course, is food chains and all that kind of stuff. So very few of those toads grow up to be adults. Same for the redwood seeds as well. We can look at the third point of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, this being natural selection. And here we can actually see a Galapagos hawk. And this Galapagos hawk has, in fact, acted as an agent of natural selection for the population of lizards. And so when we talk about natural selection, it's a force in the environment that shapes species. In this case, the species we're talking about is the lizard species. And so for whatever reason, that lizard was removed from the lizard population. Perhaps it was slower. Perhaps its behavior was bolder. Perhaps it was more brightly colored. Not sure. But whatever it was lacking, it will no longer pass those genes on to other lizards. Its lineage has now stopped. And so the definition of natural selection, and you should know this exactly, so this is an important one to memorize. I would definitely know the definition of biological evolution and natural selection. Natural selection is defined as increased survival and reproduction of the best adapted individuals as selected by nature, by the environment. So nature selects which variations are favorable and which ones are not in a particular place and time. And the place and time matters. We have different selective forces in tropical regions than we do in Arctic regions, for example. And of course, the fourth and final step of Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection is evolution itself. And this is where I said, evolution simply means that the better adapted individuals leave more genes in the next generation, and so this changes the structure of the population. And so in the example of our lizard, the next generation of lizards will not include any more genes from that lizard that got taken to dinner. In fact, it was dinner, right? And evolution defined again, changing the genetic structure of a population over time. So we showed you how can't remember his name. Lamarck, golly, showed you how Lamarck could not, how he hypothesized that the giraffe got its long neck. This is how evolution by natural selection, Charles Darwin would explain it. He would say that some individuals have longer necks than others, and some have shorter necks than others. And as they grow into adulthood, the longer-necked ones have an advantage in this struggle for existence. They're able to get more food than the shorter-necked ones, and so we put R.I.P., rest in peace, for the short-necked ones. And the long-necked ones grow up and reproduce with other long-necked ones, which also survived, and their offspring have long necks. And so that's the idea. So that it says compare to slide 10 here. Hopefully that's Lamarck's study. It's kind of interesting that we have in the giraffe family an animal called an okapi, which is a short-necked giraffe that lives in dense forest in equatorial Africa. And it's kind of dark, and it has its flanks are striped like a zebra. It's kind of an interesting idea. And there's our okapi. Okay. And I guess by way of conclusion, we can say that natural selection acts on the individual, but only populations evolve. And that simply means that individuals live or die or reproduce because of selective forces. But the genes of an individual do not change. You die with the same genes that you're born with. But how well you survive and whether or not you reproduce and how much you reproduce is determined by those genes. And so if you have favorable variations, genetic variations, then you will survive and reproduce more. And that's simply all that we're saying. You should be able to explain this sentence, that natural selection acts on the individual, but only populations evolve. And we're going to end this module right here.